A spring storm hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blackwell Tower, each gust like a warning whispered through glass. Julian Blackwell stood unmoving, his tall frame casting a shadow across the marble office. His sharp eyes, cool as polished slate, stared down at the glowing veins of Chicago below, pulsing with restless life. To him, the city was nothing but design, predictable, measurable, and always under control. At 39, Julian had risen from a nameless foster child to the most formidable architect-turned CEO in urban development. Blackwell Urban Design wasn't just a firm, it was a movement that reshaped skylines. Behind every award-winning blueprint lay sleepless ambition, ruthless negotiation, and one unwavering rule: emotion is liability. Attachment is an open flaw. And yet the fortress he'd so meticulously crafted, his reputation, his empire, was beginning to show fractures. His board, made up of conservative investors and legacy trust funds, had grown restless. They needed a stable figurehead to match the company's global influence. To them, Julian's personal life was a red flag. No spouse, no children, no roots. He was a PR risk in a world hungry for curated perfection. They didn't want reality. They wanted the illusion: a respectable marriage, a poised wife at charity dinners, and just enough softness to keep shareholders comfortable. Julian despised performance. He didn't entertain sentiment, and he certainly wouldn't surrender control of his life to love. But optics? Optics could be engineered. So he devised the cleanest solution: turn marriage into a contract. No romance, no surprises, no messy emotions to untangle. Just signatures, timelines, and conditions. He had done it 1,000 times, with land, buildings, corporate buyouts. Now he'd do it with a person. As thunder cracked across the skyline, Julian turned from the glass. On his desk lay a neatly prepared document, clipped and bound, a marriage agreement, drafted by the city's top legal team. Alongside it, a medical care proxy, ready to activate. Only one thing was missing: her signature. And she was arriving tonight. Mia Rowe had never stepped foot in a building so tall. Blackwell Tower loomed like a monument to power and precision, all steel and glass and silence. She felt swallowed by it the moment the elevator doors opened, her reflection flickering in mirrored walls as she was led to the top floor. At 28, Mia had lived most of her life in the quieter corners of Wisconsin, a small house in the suburbs of Milwaukee, a classroom of second graders in construction paper hearts. Her life had always been modest, simple, and full of responsibility. When their parents died in a car crash 5 years ago, Mia became the only family left for her little brother Noah, barely 13 then, diagnosed with a rare congenital heart condition. Teaching by day, caregiving by night, she did everything she could to keep him alive. And now she was here, sitting across from Julian Blackwell, the architect whose name graced headlines and whose firm had bought out nearly every block surrounding the downtown square. Every block except hers. The old house she inherited from her parents was the last piece of land in the way of his billion-dollar redevelopment project. A house she refused to sell, not because of pride or rebellion, but because she had nowhere else to go. Julian could have crushed her with legal tricks, zoning laws, eminent domain. Instead, he had made a different offer, a disturbing one, a calculated one, a marriage contract, 3 years. Public appearances, a private life kept carefully distant. In exchange, her brother would receive lifelong private medical care. No more waiting lists, no more fear of mistreatments or unaffordable surgeries. Now she sat in his glass-walled office, her coat still damp from the storm. Her knuckles were white around the strap of her worn leather bag, but her voice didn't shake when she spoke. "I just need one promise," she said quietly. "That my brother will get the surgery, that he'll be taken care of, fully." Julian, immaculately composed behind his desk, gave a curt nod. It's already in motion. His transfer has been arranged. The cardiac team is standing by. I don't go back on deals. He slid a stack of papers toward her, thick, clinical, ironclad. The terms were clear, the boundaries final. Mia stared at them for a long moment. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't even a sacrifice. It was survival. For Noah, she whispered, and picked up the pen. She signed her name beside Julian's with the calm of someone who had no other choice. Across the desk, he watched her with that unshakable gaze of his, measuring, unreadable. But something shifted beneath it, something he wasn't prepared for. Complication, humanity. Mia Rowe, a school teacher with tired eyes and a stubborn soul, had just become the last piece of his plan, and maybe the first crack in his perfect design. They married on a gray Tuesday morning under the marble archways of Chicago City Hall. No flowers, no vows, no celebration, just paperwork. The clerk's voice was flat, mechanical, as if reading the terms of a property exchange. Mia stood beside Julian Blackwell in a borrowed dress, cream-colored, simple, modest, chosen by one of his assistants. It fit her well enough, but it didn't feel like hers. Julian wore a tailored suit in charcoal gray, every button in place, his expression as unreadable as stone. He looked at her once, a brief flick of his gaze, then away again. Cold, detached, like he was reviewing a blueprint rather than standing beside his bride. When the clerk asked, "Do you, Julian Blackwell, take Mia Rowe to be your lawfully wedded wife?" His voice was calm, hollow. "Yes." Mia hesitated a fraction longer. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "Yes." 2 rings were exchanged, smooth platinum bands without engraving, without sentiment, just another formality. A camera clicked, a flash. It was done. She stepped out of the courthouse not as Mia Rowe, the school teacher from Milwaukee, but as Mia Blackwell, wife to a man who hadn't smiled once the entire morning. They said nothing as they entered the waiting town car. Julian tapped through emails on his phone, every move precise and practiced. Mia sat beside him, her fingers clutched in her lap, watching the blur of Chicago roll past the tinted glass. Towering buildings, crosswalks full of strangers, the world moving on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The penthouse took her breath away. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress in the sky. Marble floors, sweeping views of Lake Michigan, floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture so expensive it felt untouchable. She had grown up in a modest 2-bedroom house with a leaky faucet and a creaky porch swing. This world? It felt borrowed, foreign, sterile. Julian walked ahead of her, silent, controlled. At the doorway, he spoke without turning. "Your brother's suite is on the 2nd floor. He was moved in earlier today. Everything's been arranged." Then he stepped into the private elevator and was gone. Mia stood there in the grand hallway, clutching the strap of her worn handbag like it was the only real thing she had left. The housekeeper showed her to her room, one of the many in the penthouse. The sheets were crisp. The room was beautiful. And yet it felt like a showroom, not a place where someone actually lived. Later that night, she found her way to Noah's room. He was already asleep, surrounded by quiet monitors and soft lights. A private nurse greeted her kindly and left them alone. Mia sat by his bed, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, watching the slow, steady rhythm of his breath. He looked peaceful. For the first time in months, there were no beeping hospital alarms, no crowded emergency rooms, no paperwork she couldn't afford to sign. Tears stung her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. He was safe. This wasn't what she'd ever imagined her wedding day would look like. It wasn't warm or full of love. She'd walked into a life of silence and distance. Julian hadn't touched her since the handshake. He hadn't spoken to her beyond necessity. She was alone in every way but one. Noah was alive. And that, she told herself as she curled into a too large bed in a too empty room, would always be worth it. Even if she had married a man who felt like a locked door she'd never be allowed to open. For weeks, they lived as strangers under the same marble roof. Julian was always in motion. Early meetings, late-night calls, strategy briefings that seemed to stretch until dawn. Mia hardly saw him outside the occasional passing moment, a faint nod in the hallway, or the rare glance across the vast dining table. He was disciplined, untouched, untouchable. But in the quiet, something began to shift. It wasn't in grand gestures. It lived in the smallest things. How Julian paused when Mia entered a room, how his eyes lingered a second longer than necessary when she poured her tea. It was subtle, wordless, but real. Then came the charity gala. Julian had barely said a sentence when he handed the invitation to Mia, his tone businesslike. "We're expected to attend. You'll need something suitable." He turned to Inez as always. "Arrange everything she needs." The night of the event, Mia stood in front of the mirror in a gown the color of moonlit pine. It hugged her gently, elegant and understated. Her hair curled softly around her face, her lips glossed with the faintest hint of rose. When Julian entered, he stopped mid-step. She looked like she didn't belong in his world, because she was far too real for it. In the limo, he said nothing, but his eyes occasionally drifted toward her, thoughtful, almost unsure. At the gala, he offered his arm without a word, and she took it. Just like that, they stepped into the light. Mia moved through the crowd with quiet grace. She didn't try too hard. She didn't need to. While other women laughed too loudly or posed too perfectly, Mia simply stood beside him, present, calm, grounded. Whispers followed them. "Is that Blackwell's wife? She's nothing like the women he used to date. She's real." Julian said little that night, but his hand rested at the small of her back, steady and possessive. The press captured a photo of them laughing. Just once, just briefly. But it was enough to stir speculation across the city by morning. Back in the penthouse, the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like a shared secret, but it wasn't until a storm rolled in that everything truly began to crack. Mia woke in the middle of the night to the sound of glass shattering. The wind howled beyond the windows, rain hammering against the tower like fists against a door. She slipped on her robe and followed the noise. In the dim glow of the library, she found him. Julian sat on the floor, his head in his hands, the remnants of a broken whiskey glass scattered beside him. His shirt was half unbuttoned, his tie discarded like a noose. He didn't hear her come in. His breath was ragged, his eyes distant. And for the first time, Mia saw not the cold, powerful man the city knew, but a boy, fractured, alone. She didn't speak. She simply stepped forward and sat down beside him. Not close, just near enough for him to feel her presence. Minutes passed. He didn't look at her, but he didn't ask her to leave. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "She left when I was 6. My mother packed a bag, walked out without saying goodbye." Mia didn't reply. Her silence said everything. Julian's voice cracked. "I waited on the front steps for 3 days. Thought she'd come back." He exhaled like the memory still hurt to breathe. Mia reached out, gently placing her hand near his on the floor. Not touching, just there. He finally turned to her. His eyes weren't hard tonight. They were tired, human. Something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but a tether. Fragile, quiet, undeniable. From that night on, the distance between them wasn't quite the same. It was still there. But now, so was something else. It happened without planning, without pretense, without a script. One night, when the storm outside roared like a memory neither of them could escape, Mia found herself once again drawn to the dim glow beneath the library door. Julian was there, unshaven, sleeves rolled, eyes raw. No mask, no shield, just a man on the edge of something he didn't know how to name. He didn't speak at first, neither did she. But when she stepped closer and he didn't move away, something between them cracked open. The kiss came like a breath stolen mid-thought, unsure, tender, and full of things neither of them could say out loud. He pulled her into his arms like he was afraid of losing her, and she let herself fall because, for once, it felt like truth. There was no power play, no contract clause, just warmth, just skin, just the quiet chaos of two people too broken to pretend anymore. They didn't make love to complete a deal or perform a role. They did it because, in that moment, there was no room for lies. Only need, only human softness. Mia fell asleep with her cheek resting against his chest, lulled by the sound of his heartbeat, fast, uncertain, alive. And then morning came. She woke to find the space beside her cold. The warmth had left the room with him, her dress folded neatly over a nearby chair, her name no longer spoken in softness. When she entered the kitchen hours later, Julian stood by the window, already dressed, coffee in hand, face carved in stone. Last night lingered on her skin, but in his eyes, it was already gone. When she finally gathered the courage to speak, his response cut sharper than she'd imagined. "It was necessary," he said flatly, not even turning to look at her. "That's all." Something inside her buckled. She didn't reply. She just nodded and left the room, feeling her heart fracture one silent inch at a time. That same afternoon, while trying to escape the silence that screamed through the penthouse, Mia wandered into Julian's office, hoping to find some trace of last night. Anything that would say it wasn't just strategy. Instead, she found a locked cabinet slightly ajar. Curiosity and something deeper, desperation, pushed her forward. Inside, a black folder, thick, stamped with her name. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Page after page. Photos of her in Milwaukee, at the grocery store, walking Noah to appointments, reading on the porch, dated months before she'd ever met Julian Blackwell. Her breath caught. These weren't chance meetings. She hadn't been approached because she was the last landowner standing. She had been watched, chosen, calculated. One note near the top burned into her memory. Emotionally pliable, protective of brother. Will comply if medical leverage applied. Mia sank to the floor, the file clutched against her chest, her lungs hollow. Last night had felt like the beginning of something real, but now she saw it clearly. She hadn't been loved. She'd been targeted, not as a woman, not even as a person, as a solution. Her hands trembled, but her face stayed calm. Because heartbreak, when it comes from betrayal, doesn't scream. It walks away slowly, quietly, carrying every shattered piece it once believed in. So she packed not just clothes, but trust, dignity, and the last ounce of hope she had left. She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry out or curse his name. She simply disappeared. When Julian woke that morning, the penthouse felt unusually still. At first, he assumed she was with Noah, or walking the corridor lost in thought the way she often did. But something was wrong, off. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. He checked the guest suite, empty. Then the kitchen, the library, the bedroom. Her closet stood open, bare. Her coat, her shoes, her scarf, all gone. And on the marble countertop, neatly folded, sat a piece of paper with a single line in her handwriting. "Thank you for saving my brother. I'll handle the rest of my life on my own." Julian stared at it, frozen. Not for seconds, for minutes. His mind, always sharp, calculated, and mercilessly efficient, went completely still. He had lost control, not of a deal, not of a contract, of her. The hours that followed were a blur. He tore through the penthouse again and again, as if she might somehow still be hiding in some shadowed corner of it, waiting to be found. She wasn't. He called her phone. No answer. He messaged her. No reply. He called Inez, his assistant, even the driver. No one knew where she had gone. By the second day, Julian had postponed meetings. By the third, he was ignoring calls. By the fifth, he was no longer the man the board feared. He was simply a man unraveling. He drove aimlessly through Chicago, past schools, hospitals, even the blocks where her land once stood. Nothing. She had vanished into the city, like rain into the pavement. No address, no trace, no way back. But on the seventh day, instinct, or maybe guilt, led him to the one place he hadn't gone yet. The hospital. Noah's room was quiet when Julian entered. The nurses recognized him and let him in without question. Noah was sitting up, sketching something on a notepad. His face looked better, healthier, even stronger than the last time Julian had seen him. Julian stood at the doorway, unsure for the first time in his life what to say. Noah looked up. "She left, didn't she?" Julian nodded once, the motion almost painful. "She didn't tell me where." Noah's face was unreadable, but after a moment, he set his pencil down. "She cried the whole night before, but she still smiled at breakfast." Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I didn't mean to hurt her." Noah tilted his head. "But you did." Julian's voice cracked when he spoke again. "I thought I could control it all. The deal, her role, the outcome, but," he faltered, "I never planned on what it would mean to lose her." Noah looked at him for a long, still moment. Then quietly he said, "She wasn't asking you to plan anything. She just wanted to be real." And that was the moment Julian understood. All the power, the strategy, the structure, it meant nothing now. Because the one person he couldn't buy, couldn't predict, and couldn't replace had walked away. And this time, there was no blueprint that could bring her back. He found her in a quiet corner of the city, far from steel towers and glass-walled boardrooms. A modest apartment above a laundromat, where the windows stayed cracked open and the smell of lavender drifted through the stairwell. Julian stood outside her door for a long time. He didn't knock at first. He just stared, trying to breathe, trying to find the words that wouldn't sound hollow, words that might mean something again. When he finally raised his hand and knocked, 3 soft taps like a question, the door creaked open. Mia stood there, bare-faced, calm, tired. She didn't look surprised. She said nothing, just waited. Julian took a shaky breath and stepped forward, then to her shock, dropped to his knees on the worn wooden floor. "I never kneeled for anyone," he said, eyes shining. "Not in courtrooms, not in boardrooms, but I'd kneel 1,000 times if it meant undoing what I did to you." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with something that wasn't just regret, it was grief. "I chose you like an architect picks stone. I studied you, measured your life, labeled your love for your brother as leverage, and then I used it to bind you to me." She didn't flinch, but she didn't look away either. "I thought if I gave you safety, comfort, control, then that would be enough. But it wasn't for you, and it sure as hell wasn't for me." He exhaled, trembling. "I don't want to rebuild my company, Mia. I want to tear down every lie I built between us." There was silence. Then at last her voice, steady and clear. "Tell the truth," she said. "Then we'll talk." Julian looked at her as if she'd just offered him air. He stood slowly, nodding, not with pride, but with surrender. The next morning he stood in front of the entire city. Reporters filled the press room at Blackwell Urban Design. Rumors had swirled all week, but nothing could have prepared them for what came next. Julian stepped up to the podium. No legal team, no carefully crafted statement, just him. "I married Mia Rowe under false pretenses," he began. I orchestrated every detail. I treated her like a tool to stabilize my company. I manipulated her love for her family. And then, when she gave me a piece of her heart, I denied it. Gasps echoed. Pens scribbled wildly. Cameras clicked like thunder. I'm not here to salvage my reputation. I'm here to say I failed, not just as a CEO, but as a man. He paused. There's no fixing what I broke overnight, but the first brick of healing is truth, and I owe that to her. The broadcast reached millions. Board members fumed. Stocks wavered. But for the first time in his life, Julian Blackwell didn't care. Somewhere in a quiet apartment lit by soft morning sun, Mia watched. And for the first time in weeks, she believed he wasn't just sorry. He was finally becoming real. The fallout came fast and unforgiving. Julian's confession made national headlines. Within 48 hours, Blackwell Urban Design stock plummeted, investors pulled out, and former partners publicly distanced themselves. Lawsuits began to form like storm clouds. Board members resigned. The empire he'd spent half his life constructing, column by column, contract by contract, crumbled beneath him. But amidst the wreckage, Julian didn't fight to save the pieces. He let it fall, because he had found the only thing he couldn't afford to lose again. Mia. She didn't run back into his arms overnight. Forgiveness, she told him, was not a ribbon tied at the end of a press conference. But she saw what the world saw, that he had finally chosen truth over control, and her over everything else that mattered. They left the penthouse behind without ceremony. No press followed them to the small apartment they rented on the quiet west side of Chicago. A sunlit second-floor walk-up with creaky floorboards and a fire escape that overlooked a narrow alley full of flower pots and life. It wasn't glamorous, but for the first time, it felt like home. Mia enrolled in nursing school part-time. She kept her hair up in a bun, carried her textbooks everywhere, and sometimes fell asleep over anatomy charts at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea by her elbow. Julian, stripped of title and power, began again. Not with skyscrapers or luxury hotels, but with a small studio, an architecture collective focused on local projects, affordable housing, school playgrounds, public gardens. Buildings not meant to impress, but to belong. They shopped at weekend farmers markets, took Noah to checkups, argued over where to put the basil plant. He made her tea every night without asking how she liked it, because now he remembered. Sometimes they sat in silence on the balcony, Mia curled up on an old lawn chair, Julian beside her, one hand resting over hers. They talked about things that didn't matter and others that did. What kind of dog they'd adopt one day, how Noah was finally gaining weight, whether love was always supposed to feel this quiet. One evening, after they watered the tomato plants and folded fresh laundry, Julian watched her laughing with Noah over a shared bowl of popcorn. Her eyes glowed under the warm kitchen light, and in that moment he realized he had never truly lived until now. His company was gone, his fortune scattered, his legacy questioned. But in this tiny apartment, with this one woman and the life they were building slowly, imperfectly, together, Julian Blackwell had finally earned something no amount of steel or money could ever secure: peace, belonging, love. The news came on an ordinary morning when the kettle was whistling and rain tapped gently against the window pane. Mia stood by the sink, one hand resting protectively on her stomach, the other clutching a test that confirmed everything her body had already whispered to her. Julian entered the kitchen half asleep, rubbing his eyes, mumbling something about making her toast. But the moment he saw her face, flushed, unsure, glowing in that quiet way he had learned to read, he stopped mid-step. She didn't say it right away, just looked at him, eyes glassy but calm. Then, barely above a whisper, "Julian, I'm pregnant." The world tilted. His heart stuttered. For a breathless moment, he couldn't move. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, dropped to his knees in front of her, and pressed his forehead against her stomach like he was bowing to something sacred. "You're sure?" he breathed. Mia nodded, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Julian didn't cry. Not yet. He just wrapped his arms around her waist and held her tightly, so tightly, as if letting go might make it untrue. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake beside her, one hand resting gently over the curve that wasn't yet there, feeling something shift inside his chest. Something massive and irreversible. For so long, he had lived in fear of vulnerability. But now, vulnerability felt like life blooming inside the woman he loved. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. Over the following months, their life settled into a new rhythm. Julian became fiercely protective, not of her body, but of her peace. He cooked her breakfast every morning, tracked every prenatal appointment, kept a secret list of baby names on his phone. He built a small wooden cradle by hand, sanding every curve with care he never gave to any skyscraper. Mia studied in soft stretches between naps and kicks. She laughed more, glowed as they said. Noah was ecstatic, already picking out lullabies and arguing over middle names. And then, one crisp spring night, as cherry blossoms bloomed on the sidewalk trees below, the baby came. It was fast, intense, raw. Julian held Mia's hand through every contraction, whispered encouragement through clenched teeth, felt her pain like it was carved into his own ribs. And then, after hours that felt like a lifetime, a cry broke through the silence, high and real and beautiful. He didn't expect the tears, but they came, not slow or quiet, but sudden, choking, full. Julian Blackwell, once the untouchable architect of Chicago, once the man who built towers to protect himself from the world, wept as the nurse laid their daughter on Mia's chest. Her tiny fingers curled instinctively, her eyes shut tight, her skin warm against the trembling breath of her mother. He leaned down and kissed Mia's forehead. "You gave me a family," he whispered. And for the first time in his life, his tears weren't born from loss or fear. They were tears of something he had never truly understood until now. Not power, not success, not legacy, but this, a home, a beginning, a life found, not earned. 1 year later, on a golden afternoon that smelled faintly of spring rain and lavender, they returned to where it all began. Not the penthouse, not the courthouse, but something far more sacred. Julian carried their daughter Lily in his arms, her chubby fingers tangled in the collar of his shirt, her big curious eyes watching the sky as they stood by a small gravesite under a blooming tree. Mia knelt beside the headstone, gently placing a bouquet of purple flowers at its base. "For you, Mom," she whispered, "and for you, Dad." Then she turned to Lily with a smile. "This is where home started, even before we knew it." Julian didn't speak. He just stood behind them, eyes soft, heart full in a way no title, no award, no skyline had ever given him. On the drive back to the city, Lily babbled happily from the car seat, chewing on a soft giraffe toy as Mia leaned her head against Julian's shoulder. No words passed between them, but none were needed. That evening, they sat on their tiny west side balcony as the sun melted behind brick rooftops. Tomato plants swayed gently in the breeze, and Lily dozed in Mia's arms, one hand clutching a corner of her baby blanket. Julian's arm wrapped around Mia's back, drawing her closer. His other hand rested lightly on Lily's small feet. The city hummed around them, subway rumbles, soft jazz from a distant window, a neighbor watering plants 2 stories down. But up here, time slowed. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't plan the future. They just listened, to the wind through the lavender, to Lily's slow, even breath. to the rhythm of a life that asked for nothing more than presence. The city no longer looked like a blueprint. It looked like life, unplanned, imperfect, and breathtakingly real. And for the first time, Julian was no longer its architect. He was simply a man, at home,